All right, let's get started. Let's call to order the January 8th, 2016 meeting of the SDCERS Board of Administration. Cynthia, do we have a quorum?
Yes, we have a quorum.
With that said, we have a new member on our board. Welcome to the dais, Karina Coleman. She's been a member of our investment committee for some time now and was recently vetted by the mayor's office and approved by council to join us up here. So with that, Mark, is there any comments you would like to make?
I would just like to say that Karina's background in investments is just rock solid. She's have over 15 years of experience. One of her positions most recently was with the Walt Disney Company, and I just saw the Rose Parade, and they make wonderful floats, and Walt Disney, of course, has all the rights to the Star Wars movies, so I don't know why you left Walt Disney and went to Semper Energy, but anyway, we're very glad that she's on the board. She's been adding a lot of value in her year's term as a committee member, so welcome.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll move on down the agenda. Item number 3, approval of consent agenda items A through D.
Alan, could you really quickly, could you acknowledge if there's any public comment?
Oh, yes, there is no public comment.
Thank you.
Sorry. With that, now we'll go to the consent agenda. Items A through D. Take a motion to approve the consent agenda items unless there's a board member wishing to pull an item for a separate discussion. So with that, we'll wait for the motion to come up. There we go. I have a mover of Dick Wilkin, a second of Tom Sullivan.
Ready to vote. All votes are in.
And that motion is passed 10-0. Audit Committee. Lee Parvano is going to do the Audit Committee report in the absence of Denise Thompson today. First item is staff's recommendation to approve the issuance of the RFP for the Independent Financial Audit Services.
Good morning. We have utilized the services of Macias, Janney & O'Connell, MGO, as our external auditors since 2005. This RFP that's before you would be for a term of 3 years and with a 2-year extension option. Any RFP responses received would be evaluated by staff, and at least the top 2 candidates would appear in front of the Audit Committee, who would make a recommendation to the board for hire. This passed the Audit Committee 5-0. This requires a vote by the board.
So there's a motion up. If there's questions, we can discuss it now, but there's a motion up for staff to approve the recommendation of the issuance of the RFP for the Independent Financial Audit Services. And this did pass committee unanimously, you said?
Yes.
So there's not a second required, so as the president, I will make the motion in the absence of Denise. Is that the...
Yes.
There we go.
Ready to vote. All votes are in.
Excited about the vote. And that motion passed 10-0.
Even more so about enjoying the board, maybe.
All right, Lee, item number 2.
The next 3 items were all issued by came as a result of the audit that happened of the fiscal year 2015 CAFR. They were all presented by Jim Godsey of MGO. He filled in for Richard Green, who was the partner on our audit engagement. The first one is to receive and accept the fiscal year 2015 Independent Auditors Report. On the CAFR that's in each one of your cubbies, probably behind you, we received a unmodified opinion, which is to say that SDCERS received a clean opinion for the fiscal year 2015 CAFR. The second item is to receive and accept, sorry for this, and this is a long one, the fiscal year 2015 Independent Auditors Report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters based on an audit of financial statements performed in accordance with government auditing standards. The purpose of this report is to describe what MGO's, the scope of their work over internal controls and on compliance and what they do. It is not to report on internal controls or give an opinion on internal controls, but they did note in the report that there was no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies discovered during their audit, and there was no instances of non-compliance or other matters that are required to be communicated to the board. Lastly, presented by Jim Godsey, it's a required communication. It's to receive and accept the fiscal year 2015 report to the Audit Committee and Board of Administration. This is a required communication from an auditor that issues an opinion on financial statements. There are a couple things I just wanted to note that came out in that report, and that there was no significant difficulties encountered with management. There was no known or likely misstatements identified by the auditors, and they were pleased to report there were no disagreements with management. The CAFR was issued this year a week and a half earlier than it was last year, which is, and with the three things I just mentioned, is a real testament to the work that your staff has done to get this thing done. It was a big effort headed by Ted, but it also involves all the other departments to get this thing done. Lastly, there was two status reports. The first one presented by me, and that gave a status of all the audits that are in progress, the ones that have been completed and the ones that are still ongoing. And Johnny Tran provided the committee with a report on compliance. And the next meeting is on March 9th. Be happy to answer any questions.
Nobody in the queue? Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
All right, next up, business operations. This is the presentation of the 2015 Actuarial Evaluation by Cheiron. We have a public speaker on this, Michael Zuquette. If you want to come on up, Mr. Zuquette. And Mr. Zuquette has requested 5 minutes, and I'll grant that, considering the importance of this item.
Thank you. You can throw me out if I get out of line before then.
If you start repeating yourself, I'll cut you off.
Deal. Pardon me. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. My name is Mike Zuquette. I represent the San Diego Municipal Employees Association, and I wanted to comment and ask your consideration for some issues I'd like to bring up regarding your November meeting decision to lower the employee wage inflation assumption by a quarter point. For starters, as you may recall, in your 2-hour meeting, there was virtually no discussion of why you voted or why a board majority voted to do that. In fact, the maker of the motion, who's not here at the moment, apparently had a pre-written motion that he brought to the board, and he read it, and it didn't have anything. It didn't say anything about the wage inflation. It simply lowered the discount rate in 2 steps, and staff prompted the maker of the motion, well, what about the wage inflation? And he said, oh yeah, that too. That was the extent of your discussion. So I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because you have no record as to why you did what you did. Now in the past, you've typically lowered the wage inflation assumption at the same time you have lowered your discount rate. But it's not clear why you do that or why those aren't two independent factors that should be considered separately. And I guess what I'd like to bring to your attention is I think when you consider those facts and factors that were or should have been before you back in November, you would actually make the opposite decision. But before I do that, I want to point out that your action was, at least according to your actuary's PowerPoint today, page 6, is that, quote, the SDCERS, that your vote was to reduce the wage inflation rate from 3.3% to 3.175% for the 2015 valuation and 3.05% for the 2016 valuation. But the problem with that is, for the city of San Diego, your wage inflation assumption for those years is already 0. As you know, we're in the middle of a 5-year pensionable pay freeze, and in 2013 this board voted to change the wage inflation assumption to 0 through the fiscal year 2018. So that is some sort of mistake, at least with respect to the city of San Diego. But even if you say, okay, well, yeah, we'll just bump it out to the future years, the problem with that is at the time you made your decision in November, you were in possession, or should have been in possession, of 2 contracts that had been approved and ratified and were binding between the city and the Police Officers Association and the city and the Municipal Employees Association, both of which include 3.3% across the board pensionable pay increases in fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020. And so those 2 bargaining units cover more than half of your active members. The city remains in negotiation with the other bargaining units, but again, with contracts that you had in hand, why you would lower the wage inflation rate below what you know those contracts to already be seems like either that information wasn't considered or perhaps I'm missing something. And in fact, I would note that with respect to MEA's contract, your actuary, in communication to your staff, which I assume made it to you dated August 28th, 2015, said that our increase is actually higher than 3.3% because in addition to the across-the-board pensionable pay increase, we have a couple hundred special salary increases, which pushes the cumulative amount above 3.3%. So again, the contracts that are in front of you suggest that you should increase your wage inflation rate assumption, not lower it. I would also note that, for years this board had an assumed rate of wage inflation of 4.25%, and that was a very conservative assumption. Conservative meaning it's unlikely that the city would reach 4.25%. The city employees in the room would smile at the notion that we get 4.25% raises every year, meaning when it came time to do your experience studies, you would recognize an actuarial sort of gain because you had been a little conservative in your assumptions. And indeed, this board, particularly with your discount rate and all of your assumptions, has been very conservative, and you've moved the assumptions much more conservatively, and I'm not commenting on any of that. It's just odd that the one actuarial assumption you've been, I don't know if liberal is the right word, but much less conservative on, much more aggressive on, is this wage inflation assumption, and I'm not sure why. And again, there's really no record to support it, so that's not a rhetorical question. Maybe that's something that could be discussed today, but we would argue that you should be just as conservative in your assumptions about wage inflation as you are with everything else, in part because, as you know, the City of San Diego employees are in the middle of about a 10-year pensionable pay freeze, effectively. There's some pent-up demand to get city employees more competitive in the marketplace of public employees. But again, you don't need to read those tea leaves about the future. You've got these contracts in front of you that are already binding that should lead you in a different direction. So essentially, and forgive me for using this loaded word, but if you leave this wage inflation assumption alone, you're essentially underfunding the system because you already know, as you sit here today, that the wage inflation for City of San Diego employees is going to be higher than not only the 3.05% that you moved it to last meeting, but higher than the 3.3% that you had before last meeting. So my two requests are that you reconsider that decision today, direct your actuary to make the appropriate changes when you vote on this valuation in March. Today, as I understand it, is sort of the draft. But secondly, and respectfully, I would ask that you spend as much time on the wage inflation assumption and as much thought and as much deliberation on that as you do on the discount rate. And I would also note your San Diego Municipal Code requirements that you make a good public record as to what your good faith determination of these actuarial assumptions are. And you don't have one at the moment, and I would argue that when you make one, it'll lead you to a decision to actually increase the wage inflation assumption for the City of San Diego above 3.3%. Appreciate your time this morning, and I'll be around if there's any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Zucchett. I think he raises some fine points because I think in that discussion we did discuss predominantly the discount rate, and I think at the point where we got to the motion, everybody was quite weary with the discussion, and we didn't really have a full discussion about the wage inflation. So, Gene, I don't know if you want to try to include some of those comments in your presentation, or should we, because it is concerning to me at this point now that Mr. Zucchett brings it up that we didn't really have a full discussion on the wage inflation piece.
Okay. I'll address it up front, and then we'll go into the valuation presentation. Okay. If you turn to, we're just going to briefly go to page 6, even though that's out of order here for the presentation. When we have a wage inflation assumption for evaluation, it's not for that fiscal year. It's for the next 50 years. So, indeed, we will be using 3.3 for the valuation that just completed and 3.175. To clarify this, we could reduce the ultimate wage inflation rate. So, when we do evaluation, we project every single person out to their retirement age. What's happening this next year is insignificant compared to the wage out at retirement. So that statement could be clarified with the word ultimate, but indeed that is the assumption we would use. Secondly, we have always kept the real rate of return constant. So whenever we have changed the discount rate, we have changed the inflation rate. And that's something the board in previous years has discussed in length. You're correct, in this last meeting in November, maybe the board was wary, we didn't spend a lot of time with it, but it's how the board had always operated in previous changes to the discount rate. Finally, all these issues will come to roost when we do an experience study this spring, and we'll be looking in detail not only at this assumption, but all the other assumptions, and compare that to the experience and what the expectations are for the future.
Just one other point to add, Gene. We are assuming the 0% wage inflation through 6/30/18.
Yes.
And then the lowered rate thereafter. So I know we're in the middle of a freeze, but this doesn't mean that we assume something other than 0 through the
correct.
period of the freeze.
That's correct.
Right.
And the impact of assuming the 3.175, 3.05 dwarfs the 0% for just this 1 or 2 fiscal years.
So, and I understand that the long-term nature of the assumption, even though we've been reviewing them and changing them annually the past few years.
Right.
So how does this statement on the bottom of slide 6, when we talk about reducing it
If you
for
just
15 and 16, if we're already at 0?
this is,
Reconcile that bullet
this
point
is
for me.
the ultimate wage inflation rate. So for a given person, it's 0, as Mark said, through June 30th, 18th, and for all years thereafter, it's the 3.175 in this valuation and 3.05 in next year's valuation.
So should that say 2000?
Well, it is true for that
18?
valuation. I would say just add in the word ultimate, reduce the ultimate wage inflation rate. We have a inflation assumption for just the next few fiscal years, and then there's an inflation assumption for all future years thereafter. This is referring to the inflation rate, the ultimate inflation rate for all future years.
But it has an impact on the 15-16 valuation, even though there is we know there's no wage inflation.
But for
Because we're taking
each
that
member in the
liability
system,
for the future years and building it into the current valuation.
it is in the current valuation, because for each member, we've got to project their salary out until their retirement age. So we'll assume 0 for the next few years,
Okay.
but then the 3.175 for all future years in this valuation. So it is incorporated in this valuation.
Okay.
Alan, I had a question.
Okay. But on that one other point, though, and I'll get to the queue in a minute. If we know those contracts in place at 3.3, should that be a consideration on our wage inflation? Because the 5-year 0% contracts is what guided our 0% wage inflation for these 5 years. So if we have contracts in place at 3.3, why wouldn't we consider those contracts?
But we typically don't look at just the next contract, and Mark, you can help me with this, but we did look at the 0 because that was a specific special arrangement that we had. It was the first and only time we ever looked at a contract, because we just care about what we think the next 30 or 40 years are.
Traditionally, in the actuarial valuation, you would, clarify this if I'm wrong, you would adjust the valuation assumption if in that current fiscal year you're doing the valuation. Currently, we're in fiscal 16. If in fiscal 16 you know what the wage increases are going to be, you would replace the assumption with the actual that's in place. And we've done that. So for fiscal 16, we know that 0 is the case. That's what's in the valuation. But as Gene pointed out, that the 3.175 is basically the assumption for fiscal 19 for the next 50 years. Each and every year, 3.175. The contract that we know of right now of 3.3 only extends for, I'm not sure if it's more than 1 or 2 years, but it's certainly not for all future years.
No, I believe it's for 2 years. And we did I assume that we at SDCERS did the actuarial analysis for City Council on their contracts. So we were aware of those contracts in place. So I guess, aren't we creating a UAL by assuming 3.05 in fiscal year 18 and 19 if the contract is really going to be 3.3?
For those particular years, but then you don't know for fiscal years 20.
Okay, so that's my point. For those particular years, yes, we will be creating a UAL, but we don't know for future years.
Right. And so the assumption is that they will offset each other. We have never really typically gone into looking at specific contracts for a 1 or 2 year assumption, other than the one time we did with the 0. That's the one and only time we did it, because that was a significant departure from what happened in the past. But there have been probably contracts in prior years, well, I don't know, because it's been zero for quite some time, but typically we have a long-term assumption, and we don't let the short-term, what's going to happen next year or the year after, affect our long-term assumption. In particular, it also changes once
You seem to be doing that with the assumption rate, though, the discount rate.
we review it every year, and the board decided to lower it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, annually, we'll come here and review the discount rate, and you recall the long deliberation in November, and the
Right.
board decided to lower it.
Actually, our policy is annually to review the discount rate and the wage inflation rate, which Cheiron did review in November.
Right.
Right.
There was a review, and I remember the discussion. I remember asking David questions about price inflation versus true wage inflation, and there was some discussion in the presentation. But I know we as a board didn't have a very full discussion on it. So with that said, I'll move down into the queue. So Bill, I think you're up
I
next.
had a question. Gene, do you have a chart that shows the actual wage inflation going back like 15 years by year or something that could give us some perspective on all this?
I don't have it like,
Could you get one for the next?
we can get one, and
before the
certainly
next
when we
meeting?
do the, I'm trying to recall in November when we did the presentation. We may have it if one of you.
Should I try and pull it up?
No, just get another machine, and maybe at the end of our presentation we can find that.
Yeah.
I think it would have been in the historical inflation.
I don't think we had planned specific information.
If not, we can certainly bring that back before the board votes on this in March.
Yeah, I'd like to see it.
Because the effect of an overstated wage inflation ultimately becomes an overstated liability.
So
as-
if our
as a
wage
ci-
inflation is going to be higher, it will increase the liabilities.
Yes. So as a city employee, I can tell you, we have not averaged 4.25% raises for the 28 years I've been here.
I
So
understand.
having that assumption in place, my particular retirement liability on that assumption is being overstated.
We don't have 4.25.
Well, we did for 20-plus years, and
Right.
then we lowered again. But even with those lowerings, except for the
Well-
past 5 years at zero,
If we can, there's a few slides in this presentation that we'll go through that will demonstrate the accuracy of all the assumptions collectively, and I think that may come for
Okay.
you as far as this particular assumption.
thank you. Bill, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in on you.
I think that answers my question. I kind of want to see what during different economic cycles it did. That's why I want to go back quite a ways.
Okay. Yeah, we certainly have that data, and we'll present that.
Al?
Gene, I had understood that there was a relationship between the discount rate and the wage inflation rate, and that there was a real rate of return, which
Yes.
would be the difference, and that the real rate of return has been fairly static over time as an assumption, and probably as a reality, which would justify what we were doing. So I sort of processed it that way, and I understand Mr. Zucchette's comments. We didn't talk about it a whole lot, but I assumed it was a long-standing, well-known relationship that we were simply following suit. But that doesn't mean that he's wrong in saying we should examine whether, just because it's always been that way, doesn't mean it always has to be that way. The real rate of return could drop as a result of wage inflation invading, if you will, that real rate of return space, and I suppose that's possible. But if I were going to look at that, I guess I would want to see, is the city of San Diego wages somehow behind the curve, and we have some reason to believe that we're going to be different than other places or other times. And I guess that's a question to you, if you'd comment on that.
Well, what I'm hearing here is some talk, and Alan, you mentioned that the inflation rate's too high. Mr. Zucchet saying this is too low. We're hearing people go on all sides of the equation here, but Val has it exactly right. We have always had the practice of keeping the real rate of return constant. We could revisit that, and this spring when we do dive in deep into the experience of all the assumptions, but that's precisely why we didn't have a long discussion, because that's been the long-standing practice, and it's a very typical practice for public sectors nationally, to have a real rate of return that stays constant.
And I guess what Val is bringing up is something that we touched on, is that the way we determine our discount rate and our real rate of return brings in the formula for price inflation that we review for investments. So I guess the question is, how correlated is price inflation to true wage inflation in the city of San Diego or airport?
Well, you said it yourself. It hasn't been that correlated in the last 10 years because of the, in effect, you've had pretty much a pay freeze.
Correct.
But typically, what previous to that period happens is that wage inflation is typically equal to price inflation plus potentially some element of productivity.
Right. And I think that's what Val was asking is, how are we,
Should we go back and examine that?
in the,
We actually will be examining that in detail.
okay.
Okay.
And we defer any kind of examination of that type of assumption to an experience study as opposed to the discount rate, because that requires us to dive into the individual data. Dealing with the discount rate annually, we don't need to look at membership data and look at experience, but with the salaries, we do have to look at the individual data.
So if the real rate of return assumption needs to be adjusted, we will be talking about that when the experience
Oh,
study
definitely we'll be
comes
talking
out,
about that,
and
yes.
that will address Mr. Zucchette's points.
Yes.
Thank you.
We didn't have the data to analyze it for this past year.
Okay.
And that precisely is the purpose of the experience study.
Val, you have any more? Tanasi?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is, Mr. Zucchetto, if you have nothing nice to say, please don't say anything at all. No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry. That was a kindergarten lesson I learned way back. But no, the one thing I just wanted to comment on that other people have I think, sort of touched on is that your point is well taken, except that we have a history of meeting with the actuaries regularly and discussing these topics, and it's very hard to pull one meeting and say, oh, it was not discussed or it was discussed, when in fact there is sort of a rolling discussion of these issues. And so what I want to make clear for the record is that I think it would be inappropriate to imply, and I'm not saying that you were implying it, that the board was careless in its decision. Much like Val, much like Alan, having been on this board a little while now, going through the process, reading the reports, reading the material that the actuaries present, you do have an understanding of these things, some better than others, whatever the case may be, and so these decisions aren't made lightly. The big takeaway that I do also want to point out is we had a big discussion about a lot of these issues, and the end result was, do we have our actuary come back and do a bunch of analysis and data for us now, or do we wait for the experience study, which is just around the corner? And that experience study, as Gene has pointed out, it gets done periodically, it's done regularly, and it goes into great depth. And so it was determined by the board that it would be better to wait until that experience study is done, because it's just around the corner, and adjust those issues. And part of the reason why there's really no harm is that these assumptions, as Gene mentioned, are really forward-looking out historically. And unless you've got a wage contract that comes out and tells us what the wages are going to be for the next 50 years, it doesn't matter what they are this year or next year, because what we're looking for is that long-term assumption. And so I just want to point out those issues. Obviously, it's important to take your points into consideration, and I have a great deal of faith and confidence that Gene and his staff are doing that. The day that changes, I'll ridicule him as well. Don't feel bad about it, okay? Good. That's all.
Thank you, Tanasi. I think one of the discussion points is, or one of the concerns raised is as a public entity, we have a public record of our decisions, and maybe that meeting didn't create a very deep public record, a robust record of our decisions.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
So, Mr. Zia, I saw you approach the mic. Let me move through the queue. Yes. Yeah. Natasha? Or Natasha? Where's Natasha? There she is.
Actually, I was just going to agree with Tanasi. First one of the
I won't let it go to my head.
As the pension board, I think, we definitely want to look at the long term and, not letting independent negotiations happening at the city affect our long-term decisions. So, but yes, I think we should have waited for the discount rate discussion for the experience study as well, and have done it all together at the same time. So, just for the record.
Right, and I agree. One of the concerns I have, I do share with Mr. Zucchetto a little bit, is we have such a deep and robust discussion on investment return and how it relates to the discount rate and the assumed rate of return as an economic assumption. But when it comes to wage inflation, in my history on this board, the comparison of those discussions, we'll talk about the discount rate at a rate of 10 times more than we'll talk about the wage inflation rate, even though they're both of somewhat equal importance on our valuation. And so I would just encourage in the future a much deeper discussion. I'm not saying we need to make a change now or something in the future, but a much deeper discussion about those things and not just assume, oh, because they're connected via price inflation and how we analyze our investments, that they should just move together all the time, because they are two separate assumptions. So
I just can't resist jumping in on something like this because I love numbers so much. So we do spend a disproportionate amount of time on the discount rate. Given that the plan is closed, the discount rate by order of magnitude is perhaps 4 times as impactful as a change in the wage inflation rate. So I think we are spending proportionately more time on the discount rate because it's a more impactful assumption. But your point's well made.
yeah, thank you.
Mr. Zucat would like to speak.
All right, Mike.
You can speak, but it's not on.
Same effect. So I just, boy, just a few things, but I'll try and be succinct. First of all, with respect to Gene's point that these things have always moved the same, that's simply not true. His report in September showed that at one of the times when you reduce the discount rate 25 basis points, you reduce the wage inflation assumption by 45 basis points. And we know that because as we sit here today, forever it's been 4.25 on the wage inflation and 8% on the discount rate. And as we sit here today, or after taking into account last month's action, that discount rate has moved 100 basis points. The wage inflation has moved 125 basis points, 120, excuse me. And so it's not true that they've moved in lockstep. And so just to clarify that. Number two, as I sit here, it's sort of amazing. I mean, if you had a contract from your investment advisor, knowing what your investment returns were going to be for the next 4 years, knowing them contractually, got it done, would you really say, well, we're not going to worry about that. We're thinking long term. We're going to set the long term rate the same, even though we know the next 4 years are going to be different. Of course you wouldn't. You would set the next 4 years what you would know it to be, and then long term, there's no argument here about what you're doing after 2020. But the notion that you would just ignore what's contractually there for the next 4 years because, as articulated by the actuary and I guess now by Mr. Hovey, it's small potatoes, so don't worry about it. I can't believe that would be the accuracy test, that it's not a big deal, so we'll just leave it alone and figure it out on the backside. And in terms of, this real rate of return, as I understood your discussion, the brief discussion that your chair just talked about, there's 2 components to your inflation assumption. And I'm not engaging in the CPI projections or your real rate of return, but your wage inflation is a separate entity. And yes, there's going to be some relationships that you'll be able to see historically and with the tides, but when you've got contractual agreements demonstrating that input is wrong, I just would be surprised that wouldn't be something that you could meaningfully take care of without having to fix it after the fact, because you are, to Alan's point, you have created a UAL. Perhaps it's small, but I don't know why you wouldn't fix it. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I wasn't suggesting that the board acted carelessly, but in the face of the information you have in front of you, I just don't know why you wouldn't take that into account. Thanks for the opportunity, and now I'll go to the back of the room.
Thanks, Mike. All right. Nobody else in the queue? Gene?
Okay.
You may do your presentation now.
I won't respond anymore so we can move on, but I think Thanasi said it best. So once a year, and it comes in January, we present the snapshot valuation of SDCERS. This is collecting all the membership data and the like, and this is the preliminary results that we'll present here today. And as has been done in several years, we'll present preliminary results in January, give the board until March to consider evaluation, and then in March is when the board action actually takes place. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to let the staff do some of the presentation and turn it over to Alice Alsberg, this will be her first presentation, and she's happy there's a board member who's first meeting.
Second presentation.
Oh, second? Okay, sorry.
November, I introduced a few slides. Thanks, Gene. All right, so going down the list of our topics for discussion today, first we'll introduce some information, some background information that we feel is relevant. Then we'll have a look at historical trends, the preliminary valuation results, our projections, and then in the appendix we do have member contribution rates for the city, which do have to be revised every time there are assumption changes based on substantially equal. So the pension tank. This tank has been around longer than I've been alive. It represents the pension system, so the size of the tank depicts the liabilities of the system, and the water, the assets. So we see that water flows in, money flows into the plan through employer contributions and employee contributions, and money flows out of the plan in the form of benefits and expenses. Now, the real regulator of the assets that are in the tank is the floater at the top, the investment earnings, which are dependent on market returns. So, of course, the desire here is to have a full tank where the assets meet the liabilities. Now, for timing, right now we're in fiscal year 16, and we are presenting today the results of the June 30, 2015 actuarial valuation, and the actuarially determined contribution, the ADC, that's determined from these results will be paid this is for fiscal year 17, and typically the plan sponsors pay the ADC on the first day of the fiscal year, so July 1st, 2016. Now we're here today with preliminary results, and as we mentioned, when we come back in March, before the March meeting, you'll have the final reports, and it's at that March meeting that the board votes on the results of the valuation. This slide really just serves to show the complexity of the system. So we do have the 3 plan sponsors, the city, the Unified Port District, and the Airport Authority. And within each plan sponsor, there are multiple benefit tiers depending on a member's date of entry into the system. Now, we've already been over this slide, but just to reiterate, the results of the June 30, 2015 valuation are taking into account the board's decision to reduce the discount rate by 25 basis points over the next 2 years. So for this valuation, we see the move in the discount rate from 7.25% to 7.125%, and then down to 7% will be seen in the 2016 valuation. And that same reduction is taking place for the wage inflation assumption, 25 basis points over 2 years. Now for the next 3 topics, we have historical trends, the preliminary valuation results, and projections. Rather than going through each topic slide by slide, we're going to go through by plan sponsor. So we'll first cover the city, then the port, then the airport.
Okay, this next slide is probably provides the most information of any slide in this presentation. It shows historically the blue bars, what the system's liabilities have been. The 2 sets of lines are the market value of assets, which are green, and the gold line are the smooth value, actuarial value of assets. And the funded ratios at the top are the ratios of the gold line smooth value of assets to the liabilities. So you see during the period 1995 up until 2000, the system was close to full funding. And we had the market downturn in 2001 following 9/11, and then MP1, MP2, and the like continue to drop that funded ratio down to 67, 65% in 2004. The markets returned strongly up until 2008. Funded ratio improved, and then you see the significant drop caused by the 2009 valuation as a result of the 2008 losses. And now we've been on a steady climb up since then. And if you look at the last dot, we are carrying an actuarial value of assets that's actually less than the market value. So even if we have losses this year, there's some gains from prior years that haven't been recognized. But one of the things I like to show about this chart is look at the comparison of the gold bar to the I'm a little colorblind here. I think it's a green line, the market value. When markets are strong, the gold bar lags the market value. When we have a tank in the market, the gold bar stays above, and that's the purpose of the smoothing. We're currently at 75.6% funded on a smooth basis, just under 80% funded on a market value basis. The next chart compares the actuarially determined contributions since 2003, that's the blue bar, to what the city paid, and by the way, the actual determined contribution is for the city, and then what the member pays is not part of the ADC, but it shows here that since fiscal year 2009, the city has always paid the actual determined contribution. In 2011, they paid, or 10, they paid more. But you see in the period 2003, 4, and 5, not only did we have some of the benefit enhancements that took place, but the city was under-contributing. You see the member contributions, and the city was offsetting the member contributions for many years up until 2012, and now the members pay their full amount of the contribution.
On this slide, I think what I found interesting about this slide is if you take this slide and you compare it, and you mentioned it briefly, to the previous slide, and you look at where the funding ratios are cruising along nicely at the 90% range, and then in 2001, 2002, 2003, where the plan sponsors weren't making their full payment, is really began the development of our UAL issues.
And then that was just compounded by the poor markets that followed.
Exactly, and got us to this where we have this UAL piece. One of the things that on this slide here, and I don't know if it's on this slide here, I'd be interested to see if you could, because I see how you broke down employee contributions paid by employer and employee contributions paid by members. But in the ADC, or paid by employer column, if you could break down normal cost versus UAL, so you could see the UAL grow.
That's a good suggestion. We'll make that improvement in the. In fact, does this chart appear in the Val report too?
It is.
We'll make that change in the Val report. Thank you. I like that change.
Thank you.
The normal cost has hovered in the $50 to $60 million range for of the city's ADC.
Right.
It's been in the $50 to $60 million range for about the last decade.
Right.
But it makes his point that as the UAL grows, you see the growing UAL cost.
Yeah.
We'll attribute it to you, Alan.
Oh.
Report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have enough stuff named after me. We can just.
The next chart is also quite important, and it kind of, we were talking about the wage inflation, but this chart is showing, let's start with the blue bars, the collective accuracy of all the assumptions after the fact. So this is looking not just at wage inflation, but mortality, retirement, disability, termination from employment. And when the blue bars appear below the zero line, that means we understated the liabilities for that year. When they appear above, we've overstated. And what we see here, if you look to the far right, that's the size of the blue bar relative to the total liability. So, for example, if you look at 2015, bottom right-hand corner, we had a liability loss of 0.3% of the liability. So typically, actuaries will be very close on the liability side in estimating because it's not like the investment markets. But if you look at 2012, 13, 14, and 15, either in the table on the far right or even at the bars, you see these small little losses occurring. We're finding out that mortality is one of the elements there. We've talked to this board about need to look at mortality. When we get to the experience study, this will be something that we will focus on heavily, this as well as all the other assumptions. But you see how dramatically different the investment gains and losses are per year, and you see how dramatic the loss of 2008 was. And in 2008, we're talking, which wasn't reflected until the 2009 valuation, it was negative 19.4% of the assets. This is why the discount rate takes so much time to talk about, because the investment return is far more volatile. But all in all, we would like to have the blue bars be up and down, and net it out, and not have a consistent pattern like we've had the past 4 years. And that is going to be a primary focus in this. experience study coming up. So that's the historic results for the city. David's going to take you through the Unified Port District and the airport with the same charts.
So the historical assets and liabilities for the UPD, you can see that back in '95 they were actually over 100% funded and stayed that way until 2003. And then the funded ratio, like the city, the funded ratio improved for a few years, and then you had the bad market in '08 that knocked them down into the 70s. And that funded ratio has kind of drifted along for a few years. It was declining for several years in a row, and then it went back up. And so now they're at 78.8% on an actuarial value basis and just over 80% on a market value basis. And like the city, if you look at that far right bar, you can see that the market value of assets is still higher than the actuarial value, meaning they're stored gains. If you look at the contributions for the UPD, you can also see, like the city, there was a big spike in fiscal 11 after the markets. And then since then, that ADC has grown pretty steadily. It hasn't jumped around all that much. Steady growth each year. The member contributions, you can actually see that they had a significant amount of the contributions are being offset by the employer at the beginning of the period, and that continues to still until today. And that our understanding is that will continue, except that for PEPRA members, offsets are no longer permitted, so eventually that may go away. Gains and losses, again, like the city, it's dominated by investment experience. Those are the bars that really jump out at you. You can see the blue bars, there was actually a long pattern of liability losses for many years, probably 8 or 9 out of 10, in a 10 or 12 year period. But over the last few years, that experience has been more mixed. We've had a couple of years with gains, including this past year. For the airport authority, so they spun off from the Port District in 2002 or 2003. You can see that the airport aggressively tried to fund the plan. That's why the funded ratio jumped from 68 to well over 100% in 2006 and 2007. They also suffered from the market, but they only went down into the mid-80s and their funded ratio. And then through a mixture of good investment returns and their policy to maintain 95% funding, meaning they put additional money in the plan in order to keep that level of funding, they've been in the mid to high 90s for the past 5 years or so. And so now they're 97.2% on an actuarial value basis and just under 100% on a market value basis. The contributions, well, you can see there where the yellow bars exceeding the blue bars, the yellow bars meaning the money that was actually put in. They've on a number of occasions put in additional money. You can see here also that the contributions have, because the funded ratio has generally been around 100% for most of the period, hasn't been a significant UAL piece to their contribution. And so the member contributions and the employer contributions are pretty similar to each other, unlike the port and the city.
On that one there, David, real quick.
Yeah.
And maybe Mark can help me out here. The airport authority has a funding policy, I believe, in place that requires them to pay more than the ADC if their funding ratio dips. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, their current policy is to make additional contributions if their as David mentioned, if their funding ratio drops below 95%.
Okay.
So if it's below 90%, they need to pay whatever it takes to get to 90. And if it's between 90 and 95, they need to pay 1% more. They need to make enough contributions to increase the funding ratio by 1%.
Okay.
So anyways, it's triggers to generate increased funding, and it's happened 2-3 times in the last 6-7 years.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I raise that because our other plan sponsors don't have that type of thing in their funding policy.
Correct.
And so that's one of the reasons why we see the airport funding ratio look so good over the long term, I believe.
Right.
Now, the funding does the Port District have a similar funding policy, or do they just follow along the same funding policies as the City of San Diego?
Same funding policy as the city.
City of San Diego, and that is make their annual ADC.
Right.
Okay.
The port and the airport, as far as I can tell, have always paid their ADC. Always.
Always.
Whereas the city has now a record of 11 years in a row of paying their ADC.
Okay. Thank you.
And then finally, gains and losses for the airport authority. Again, the yellow bars are larger. but you do have some significant liability experience, especially early on as a percentage of the liability as that plan was starting out. You had some losses, but over the last 10 years or so, it's been more mixed. We've had some gains for the airport authority and some losses, so that's what you want to see is balanced experience.
When you stay on that slide for a second, as David mentioned, the liability size are larger. That's because this is a much smaller plan, and with a smaller plan, it's more difficult to apply assumptions that will work. You know, if you've got thousands of employees versus hundreds, it's more difficult to. There's more volatility in liabilities because of that, so that's to be expected.
So with that said, I mean, that raises the point, when the airport authority split off from the port district, that make it harder to do these types of valuations for their plan?
Initially, yes, and that's, if you look at that slide, the top right, on the far right, the top, -8, -11, -7.
Mm-hmm.
So we weren't actuaries back then, but clearly there was assumptions that were not adequate, and they were probably corrected, maybe overcorrected, because then we had a positive 7.7, but it looks like it's getting smaller and smaller as the plan gets larger, and so it's the natural maturation of the plan.
Okay.
It's still the case, and you'll see this summer when we go through the experience study. If there are 10 actuarial assumptions, you might wonder, does the airport and the port, do they have their own individual assumptions on each of those 10? And the answer is no, they don't. We don't have enough demographic data on some of the assumptions for the port and the airport to have their own assumptions. So we actually combine all the results, and we have one assumption that applies to all three plan sponsors. That's not the case on a number of things, but it is on a few.
Right. Which really starts to beg the question, when we go back to our previous discussion about wage inflation, because wage inflation, I believe, in the airport and UPD are probably significantly different than it is within the city.
Well, we don't assume zero for them.
We don't assume zero for them, yes. So, okay, at least in the current year, we're not. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now the current valuation results are on slide 18. And we've got three columns here. Were the actual results in 2014, what we would have expected had we kept all the assumptions the same. So the membership counts won't be affected by assumptions. So you see on the top part, we've got a drop in actives because new hires, at least for now, are going into the DC plan. And with a closed plan, you'll expect to see the average pay going up because as people get older, they're moving up to promotions and people are leaving at the younger ages. So there's nothing remarkable or significant in the membership, and for that matter, in the assets and liabilities either. You see that
I just want to make sure that people don't see that average salary increase and believe there's somehow some pay raises going on that are being captured. That's simply an averaging of the members in the plan and the
as they're
members not in
declining,
the plan.
the older people staying, and yes, that's absolutely true. We did have, if you look at the next section, the gray area, the liabilities grew more than expected. Part of that has to do with the discount rate, and the next slide will get into the details of that. The assets on a smooth basis actually did a little bit better than expected. On a market value, you did worse because it wasn't a strong market value return. But the funded ratio, had we not changed the actuarial value funded ratio, had we not changed assumptions, would have gone to 77.2. It's now 75.6. But on a market value, because market value of assets are higher, it's 77.8. And then you see the contributions going from 254, and they would have dropped to 248, but with the assumption changes, they're at 261. And the reason for the administrative expense doubling there is because we were phasing in recognition of administrative expenses over a 3-year period. Oh.
I've never seen this in the presentation. Okay.
Never seen.
Okay.
The next chart is something we look at each year. It's called the bridge chart, bridging last year's results to this year's. So at the top, we're looking at the changes in the unfunded and the actuarially determined contribution. We show the values as of last valuation. What are the actual values of this valuation? What did we expect? And then, as you can see, there's unfavorable experience, both in the UAL and the ADC. The investment experience was different than projected. That was $51.4 million, which corresponds to a $5.4 million ADC impact. The liability experience was 25.7. 17 of that was mortality. The balance was a difference between the other demographic assumptions, including wages and retirement and termination, and then there was a gain in COLA. Again, that's a very small percentage of the total liabilities, and that impacted the ADC by 2.1. The discount rate inflation assumption change was this most significant change, but I think those numbers were something we presented back in November, or at least a close estimate to that before we did the valuation. There's other miscellaneous items, but it's not a, compared to some other prior years, this is, other than the discount rate change, a year that's pretty close to what we assumed.
So just a finer point, our action last meeting increased the UAL by nearly 96 million and increased the ADC by nearly 7 million.
Yes.
So for the Unified Port District, you look at the membership at the top. Although you do have members now coming into their miscellaneous plan, there was a slight decrease in the active headcount. There was a slight increase in payroll and in average pay, and there was an increase in the number of retired members in the plan. The actuarial liability went from 433 to just under 454, which is a 4.7% increase. But the actuarial value of assets went up by 7.3% from 333 to just under 358. So your unfunded liability declined slightly from 100 million to 96 million. And as a result, your actuarial value funded ratio went from 76.9 to 78.8. And as we said before, you're still better, the port is still better funded on a market value basis because they have stored gains. They're 81.6%. Looking at contributions, last year the ADC was 14.4 million. This year it's 14.6. It's worth pointing out that last year you made a decision to explicitly fund administrative expenses, and you did it over a 3-year period. So last year was the first year of that phase-in. You reflected 1/3 of the expected administrative expenses. This year we're reflecting 2/3. So that's why that component goes from 0.2 to 0.5 million. Sources of change for the Unified Port District. So like the city, there was unfavorable experience on the UAL and on the ADC. And it's the same 3 primary components. So you earned only 3.3% on the market value of assets, causing a $3 million loss on the UAL, and the ADC increased by 0.3 million more than expected due to that source. You had positive liability experience of 1.9 million on the UAL and 0.4 million on the ADC, and more than half of that was due to COLAs being less than expected. And then, again, like the city, the largest component was reducing the net impact of reducing the discount rate and the inflation assumption. That increased the UAL by 5.5 million and increased ADC by 0.4 million. Moving on to the Airport Authority. The Airport Authority had increases in membership across the board, a slight increase in actives. The pay went up on average. More members are retiring as that plan gradually matures. The actuarial liability went up by 9.9%. It's now just under 140 million. And the actuarial value of assets went up by 11.4%. So your unfunded liability declined slightly. The airport is now 97.2% funded on an actuarial basis. And last year, the funded ratio did decline on a market value basis, so they were actually over 100% last year on a market basis. And now with a 3.3% return, they're at 99.1%. The contributions, last year the ADC was 3666,000, and now this year 3765. Like the port and the city, it's the second year of the phase-in of the administrative expenses, so that component is 198,000. Looking at sources of change for the airport, again, unfavorable experience on the UAL and the ADC, and again, it's the same 3 components that stand out. Negative experience on investments, increasing the UAL by about $1 million and the ADC by about 100,000. Positive liability experience of just under $2 million on the UAL and 200,000 on the ADC, which was a mixture of COLAs being less than expected and slight gains on pay. And then the reduction in the discount rate and the inflation assumptions, again, increased the UAL and increased the ADC.
So we then look ahead, and we show a projection. As you know, we have an interactive model here where we could change these assumptions. We're looking at, in the top graph, a projection of the liabilities. The gray bars are the liabilities, and the lines are the assets, the gold being the smooth and the green being the market value, and the funded ratios are at the very top of the chart. And you can see the liabilities actually start declining in the out years, and that's the impact of the closed plan. Down below, you see a graph of the contributions, and the employer contributions are in gold, and the member contributions are in green, and then you see the benefit payments in the red line. So there's the outflow is greater than the inflow. However, if you take into consideration the investment return on top of all the contributions, that's the blue line. And so until at least 2030 or so, or 2029, it's expected investment income and contributions exceed benefit payments. And then you see it start declining. And that's something I think Marcus said that we will be discussing at the board retreat, the implications of a closed plan. Alice, if you could flip to the model, this is the same thing you're looking at this chart, but this is live. At the very top, what we have is we could play around with the discount rate. Right now, it's set at 7 1/8, dropping to 7% over 1 year. That's what that phase-in over means. Again, I think at the board retreat, if the board wants to look at different discount rates long term, we'll be able to show you the impact here. If I know we're having a start of a bad year right now, for fiscal year, we're in fiscal year 16, right? That's ending. So if we take, just to say, if the year ends at 0, let's say, and I think you need to go to 17, make sure that's not equal to the one above it, right? Okay. So I'm looking at the ADC. It went from, and we're looking at the fiscal year 18 ADC. Instead of 267.9, a 0% year would increase that ADC to 278.1. So that's how powerful 1 year's return would be. Likewise, if things rallied and you had a 15% return, it drops it from 267.9 to 256.5. So we've done a lot of stress testing with the board in the past. Again, at the board retreat, we'll probably extensively try to play around with this and just do a lot of different stress testing, historical periods and the like.
You wouldn't happen to have the chart from 2009 handy, would you?
The chart from 2009?
Yeah, because when we published this chart from 2009, right after the market loss, there were a lot of people running around, metaphorically, with their hair on fire.
Oh, we probably showed something pretty bad, huh?
Well, yeah, there was I think the ADC would be at the 500 million mark. Right now.
So, I mean, while we're here, just go to history for a second. Alice, put 1930 in there. So now what we're doing is we're recreating the returns from 1930 to 1960. And I would ignore that blue line at the bottom because that's just reflective of the investment returns. But look at the top chart and you see how the Great Depression would have affected this plan and in the subsequent comeback years. We can go through all the periods in history and you're going to see that roller coaster.
Right.
And I always like 1950, Alice. Let's leave it to Beaver time.
There we go.
And that's a good time to return to. So it's
the lesson there. Everybody stay calm. Things are going to change.
Right, things are going to change. And David, there's we won't go through the stress testing, but the Unified Port District and are they in here in the presentation? Or Alice?
You got the separate model.
No, not the model. I don't want the model. I just want the PowerPoint.
Sure.
And I guess the only difference there is that at the bottom chart, investment returns and contributions are always in excess of the benefit payments, but other than that, it gets the 100% funding. If we played with the stress test, we would have the same up and down, and then the airport authority.
Yeah, this is the one that's different because you have significant positive cash flow And you can see at the top chart how the size of the liability proportionally grows much, much more than with the other two plans that are more mature.
So where is the sweet spot? We've talked about this a couple of times on cash flow. Where do we have a range or a sweet spot we want to be in on cash flow, positive, negative, by a certain amount? Because intuitively, it seems to me if we have a closed plan, it's at the very end when that last person dies and they get their last check, it is spot on exactly, and we have $0 left in the plan. So how do we, with the closed plan, is that really a bad thing to have negative cash flow to some degree? Because the asset should be declining over the long haul.
Well, the problem with the closed plan is as it gets more and more mature, it's more difficult to absorb up and down markets. And so you've already been taking action to deal with that by just virtue of the dropping of the discount rate. So Mark's talked about 10 or 20 years out is when we really look at the impact of that, but I think you're gradually doing it already. But to the extent your discount rate's dropping and your investments follow with less risky investments, then you eliminate that volatility. But when you, in your example, you've got 5 people left and they're all retired. If we have a 2008 market and the assets drop, there's no money there to,
right.
If you're out of active members.
But do you eliminate volatility at the expense of the sponsor by potentially overfunding?
Well, overfunding would actually increase volatility. The more assets you have, the more volatility you have. But I think volatility is ultimately impacted by your investment asset allocation.
Right. So I think you said something that's important. One of our mitigating risk strategies because of the closed plan is a lowering of the discount rate.
That lowers the target for the investment folks to
and because the plan is closed, helps minimize that volatility or risk in the future because of the closed plan effect.
Yes.
So we finish up invested in cash and bonds and...
For that last retiree, yeah.
But then again, we don't want to end up in that position with $5 billion in the plan either.
No.
So it's a very difficult and moving target.
And I think this is the primary topic of the board retreat, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Finally, and I'll let David show you, because of the discount rate changes, we have slightly revised member contribution rates.
Right, the reduction in the discount rate and the inflation rate. So we show the rates here for each of the city plans except for elected members who have a fixed contribution rate. You can see the former on the left-hand side, the current rate, and then the right-hand side, the rate under the new assumptions, and then the difference, which for general ranges from roughly 0.1% of pay to 0.2% of pay. And to put that in dollars, if you had somebody who was making $50,000 a year, a 0.2% reduction increase would be about $100 a year. So we have general members, the old general plan, the new general plan, and then police. For all the safety plans, the differences are somewhat greater. I think they range from 0.2 to roughly 0.4% of pay increases. Police plans, we have, I think there are 5 of them now. And then fire, the old plan, new plan, and then lifeguard old, and lifeguard new. And it's worth pointing out that there weren't members in the lifeguard new plan for a while, but I think one person trickled in this year. So we haven't revised these rates for, we missed the last cycle where we revised the rates with the last set of assumption changes. So this what you're seeing here, the differences are somewhat different because it's reflecting really 2 changes in assumptions. And then finally, the port and the airport, their PEPRA member contribution rates, it's required that they be revised if the gross normal cost rate goes up by more than 1% or goes down by more than 1%. And we're still looking into that as to whether that criteria has been met. And so at the March meeting, we may bring you member rates for those 2 plans as well.
Thank you, David. You mentioned something there, and I want to bring that to everybody's attention here, that the city plan has a substantially equal component, and the normal cost is split substantially equally between the employer and the employee. However, the elected plan, their contribution rate is capped at 9% by code. And maybe this is a question for Johnny or Mark, because we've had this discussion does come up a couple times. How are those members in the city plan but not subject to the substantially equal requirement? I know we've talked about this in the plan. This question comes up sometimes, and I mean
It's just not in the municipal code that
Yeah.
they are subject to it. So the law doesn't say that they're subject to it, so they're not.
So they're not. Okay. So by being silent on it, they've somehow exempted themselves from the substantially equal requirement
Right.
at the elected level. Okay. And so their contribution rate obviously is not 9%. It would be somewhere in the lines of any other general employee, although their liability, I think, is greater because their formula's greater. It's a richer benefit plan. So the city's making a substantially greater contribution on their behalf for the elected plan. Okay. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, and then just to remind you, you'll be seeing us next, the board retreat, and then in March, hopefully getting approval for the Val reports, and then once again in the summer, I think, at some point before we do the next valuation for the details of the experience study.
The underlying 60-page actuarial report that goes behind this presentation today just has more charts and graphs, but not any substantially different information. Those will be available probably in early mid-February, and then we'll get those to you in advance of the March board meeting.
Karina, I saw your name. I was on my
Very good.
view slide, so I didn't see your name in the queue. Hopefully you haven't been in there long.
No, I had a question, I think back on page 22 of the presentation where you see the differences in the funded status, particularly of the airport authority that looks to be much better funded. Do you believe it is reasonable that they essentially follow the same asset allocation as the other two plans, given the difference in funded status? And perhaps it is reasonable given the size of the assets at the overall portfolio management level.
Yes, but and you would know better than I since you're from the investment industry, probably the more important differentiator with the airport would be on slide, the last three slides. The port's going to have, the port actually could take a riskier asset allocation approach because on slide 27, not the port, the airport authority. You see how the
Did you say riskier?
well, could absorb more risk than the city because it's not a closed plan. And number two, the contribution investment income for all years exceeds benefit outflow, so they have positive cash flow. But to the extent you've got contributions and investment income exceeding benefit payments, that means you could take investment losses from year to year without having to dip into principal. So I would think that when we talk about the implication of a closed plan, we ought to be considering what do we do with the airport authority and for that matter, you can make a case that the police is an open plan too. So those are some tricky questions that I think are the reason for wanting to have this retreat.
Yeah, I'd like to have Liza add something. She's probably going to explain the asset liability study
Sure.
discusses this.
We have an asset liability study coming up in March, and we actually look at each separate plan and evaluate that. So we will be discussing that.
Dick?
To tie on to that, I assume that over time, the city needs to become more conservative in its investment allocations. But the port, the airport, and maybe the police don't. So how are we, is that what's going to be part of the topic of discussion, is how we then reconcile the differences?
Yes.
All right. Nobody else in the queue? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take a quick break, then move into Disability Committee.
Right. Very, very busy man.
These are reports.
The only one that's on the internet is B&G.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, B&G.
Not investment.
There's an audio recording of investments, but it's not on the web.
All right, do we have a quorum so we can get restarted? Yeah, we're close enough. All right, next item up will be Disability Committee. Natasha?
Okay. We had actually a fairly short meeting, and we had 5 items to go over. The item number 5 was actually continued until March, requested by the applicant. Items 1 through 4 passed unanimously, and we can, unless there's any questions, like to make the motion. No second is necessary.
So we have a motion up to approve the disability consent agenda items, 1 through 5?
Ready to vote?
Or 1
through
1 through 4, except 5. There we go.
All votes are in.
And that motion passed 10-0. Status report? Anything you want to mention on there? Just that things are going along well.
Hold on 1 second. Actually, things are going along well, so relatively quiet. Sandra was able to answer, I think, a lot of questions that trustees had. So, no, things are smooth and sailing, and Sandra's doing a great job.
We are processing more than we are getting in, which is that's a good thing. We're not falling behind, we're getting ahead. All right, next up is Business and Governance.
Thanks, Alan. The B&G committee met yesterday, and the first item on the agenda is on the consent agenda is the staff's recommendation to revise Board Rule 7.60. The committee voted unanimously to adopt staff's recommendation, and I'll move the item today. No second is necessary unless anyone wants to discuss or pull it.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
That passes 10-0. Item B1, under new business. No action is requested. The committee reviewed Board Rule 9.60, designation of beneficiary for payment of drop annuity for members who die after retirement, item A2, and did not recommend any changes. Item C1, under old business, action was requested. The committee voted unanimously to approve staff's recommendation to revise Board Rule 7.30, filing disability retirement application. I'll move the item, and no second is necessary.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
All right, that brings us to item C. Oh, that passes 10-0. Sorry. That brings us to item C2, another non-action item. Marcel Rossman reported that there is one new member owing more than $10,000, and Ms. Vieira has informed SDCERS that she plans to appeal. Then item C3, also under old business, no action was requested. Johnny Tran discussed the California Public Employment Relations Board, PERB, ruling related to Prop B. In short, PERB issued a ruling finding the city violated the law and ordered the city to, among other things, meet and confer with the unions to reimburse the unions for costs and attorney's fees for the union's anticipated legal action to overturn Prop B and to make affected employees whole. PERB acknowledged it has no authority to invalidate the 2012 municipal election, so Prop B is still the law pending any further appeals by the city or its labor unions before the court, and that would probably involve a new action, not an appeal of the ruling, which means that SDCERS will continue to follow the law as it's stated in Prop B. until and unless a court overturns that or issues a ruling on it. Staff will monitor developments on the PERB ruling and keep the board informed and work with the city on the outcome of any court proceedings. Mark Hovey explained that the city has requested SDCERS and Cheiron's assistance in actuarial modeling of costs associated with putting Prop B members into the pension plan. The city will pay all costs associated with that modeling, and the committee felt that that was an appropriate thing for the board to do. Then we get to staff reports by division. Johnny Tran gave the legal staff report, an update on the San Diego City Charter Review Committee's position on SDCERS recommendations to amend the city charter, and noted that SDCERS will be filing the port's IRS determination letter request this month. On IT, David Bond reported that all original IRIS warranty items are resolved. This is a major accomplishment. Staff has been working toward this for 18 months. David also is working with City TV to review the boardroom high-def upgrade RFP responses and expects to bring a recommendation forward to the board in March. We heard from Cynthia Queen, Member Services Status Report. Cynthia reported that the annual member statement outreach to 10,000 non-retired members was a huge success, with more than 1,000 members updating addresses, beneficiaries, and requesting refunds. Cynthia recognized the finance member Avi O'Brien for her excellent work preparing information for members who receive part of their benefit from the Preservation of Benefits Fund in order to comply with tax regulations. Avi's efforts, along with communications manager Jessica Packard and benefits administration staff, resulted in greatly improved annual process for members. And both of them are here with us today and standing up, so I'd like to recognize them and give them a round of applause. Thank you for your work. Next, we heard from Marcel again on benefits administration, and Marcel reported that benefits administration and member services reorganized to realign workloads and better serve members, with the health and death benefits staff now reporting to Sandra Clausen. Also, with the IRIS warranty work completed, the focus now is on identifying areas of improved functionality. Thank you, Marcel. And then on finance, Ted LaSalvia reported that finance is current with financial reporting through November 2015 and has completed the fiscal year 2015 CAFR filing process with the Government Finance Officers Association. The October 2015 trust financial statements were presented. As of October 31, 2015, SDCERS has a net position of $6.8 billion and total investments of $7.0 billion. For the 4 months ended October 31st, SDCERS had a decrease in net position of $110 million, reflecting a net investment loss of $66 million. The September 2015 actual expenditures versus budget, the administrative expenses totaled $10.5 million for the quarter ended September 30, 2015, which was 14% under budget. The budget was $12.2 million. Salaries, litigation expenses, and investment management fees were all under budget. As we heard from Ted, that's kind of a good news, bad news, because the investment returns were not as robust as we would have liked, which affected positively the expense. So with that, I think that concludes my report.
All right. Any questions? Board? No. All right. Thank you. Moving on to Investment Committee. Bill.
The Investment Committee met yesterday, and we had 2 action items which we approved unanimously, and then 2 items that were non-action items. We're going to go over the 2 that we approved unanimously yesterday. The first one will be the International Small Cap Equity Fund, and we're making a decision to split it in 2 between 2 managers from 1, and now we're going to go over the new manager we're going to hire.
Right, so thank you, Bill. As you may remember, GMO's International Small Cap Mandates has been on the manager monitoring report for an extended period of time. So staff decided to initiate a thorough review of the manager, but also of the International Small Cap allocation. to see if we have the best manager in the space, and also determine if we should hire a second manager and if that would benefit the mandate. So after conversations with the consultant and discussing the opportunity in the international small cap equity space, we identified a number of different risk factors that we felt could be diversified away by adding a second manager. So as you can see in the Aon Hewitt's memo, by adding Copper Rock to the portfolio, we can reduce the value tilt we currently have in the non-US equity portion of the portfolio, as well as reduce the risk statistics in that portion. So with that conclusion that adding a second manager to the allocation would be beneficial, staff and consultant initiated a search and met with several international small cap equity managers. After much consideration, we reached the conclusion that we had one top candidate, which was Copper Rock Capital Partners. So staff and Aon Hewitt representatives went to Boston to meet with Copper Rock Capital Partners in their offices and do an on-site due diligence visit. Upon completing that due diligence visit, we agreed that Copper Rock, we being consultant and staff, agreed that Copper Rock would be the best fit for SDCERS and serve as a good complement to GMO in the international small cap equity allocation. So in summary, we feel that by adding Copper Rock to the portfolio, we can achieve better diversification and some improvement in the risk-adjusted return within the non-US equity portion of the portfolio. The recommendation, therefore, is to split the mandate between GMO and Copper Rock 50-50. And with that, I can take any questions.
Jimmy?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, Liza came over and stated, because we had an issue with the fee yesterday,
Right.
and she mentioned that you've left a part of that conversation out, which is you already negotiated them down some.
Right, so they were originally at 1%, and they came down to 90 basis points. I feel they've indicated that they're willing to negotiate further on that, so we're going to do that.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that was included.
The discussion was interesting yesterday because the group that was here from Copper Rock was really quantitative, a real bottoms-up quantitative approach to selection versus GMO, which may be more top-down, looking at macroeconomic factors and sovereign country factors. And it was interesting listening to them go through it.
Actually, GMO has a more of a bottom-up selection process too in their foreign small company strategy that we're talking about, but in their global equity that we also use, they have a more of a top-down view. But I think that's their strongest suit, is their macro approach.
So I'd like to go ahead and move that we approve Copper Rock as a new manager.
Karina jumped in as a mover. You need to withdraw your rookie. All right, Bill. I think we can get your button up there for the motion as the chair.
This isn't Jeopardy.
We've all done it.
All right, we can. Okay, there we go. Bill can make the motion as the chair. No second required.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that passed 10-0.
Okay, thank you. Oh,
Thank
yes, passed 10-0. Thank you, Anders. Okay, the second action item on our list is to look at the recommendation for the separate account, the real estate separate account, which is about half of our real estate assets.
Yes. In your board materials, you have a summary of the analysis and recommendation on SDCERS real estate separate account. I wanted to start by talking about the separate account. SDCERS has an investment manager, Deutsche Asset and Wealth Management, formerly known as REEF, that buys and sells real estate properties on SDCERS' behalf. Currently, there are about 20 properties within that account. Due to the concentration of these properties, there's a higher volatility associated with that. So we're talking about properties here that are less than $40 million. The average property size is about $20 million. These are fairly small properties, and they give SDCERS a small cap bias. The separate account, as Bill mentioned, currently comprises about 52% of the real estate portfolio. This means that the separate account is really driving the performance of the entire real estate portfolio. So the goal of the analysis was to look at the separate account, assess its performance and the small cap bias, and determine whether this has helped or hurt SDCERS. Basically, the analysis found that the performance has been satisfactory. It has not hurt SDCERS, nor has it added great incremental return. The investment committee had a very robust discussion yesterday, and the recommendation is to reduce the separate account from 52% to a target guideline of 35%, while maintaining that 55% hard cap as stated in the real estate strategic plan. And also to reevaluate the separate account at a later time, most likely September, when we bring back the real estate strategic plan for your review. We plan to reduce this exposure to the separate account by redirecting the outstanding commitment to the separate account that we have right now of $47.5 million to another large complementary real estate fund, core fund, excuse me. Additionally, as properties are sold out of that separate account, that capital could then be redeployed to another strategy. This would help with diversification and also to reduce volatility. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
No questions? I think we should. I'd like to go ahead and move that we approve this action.
Did this pass unanimously yesterday?
Pardon?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
I know.
There we go.
I didn't go fast enough.
Thank you.
All right, Bill.
Okay, there we go.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And the vote passes unanimously 10-0. Okay, so now we will move into the no action items. First, we'll do the annual review of the cash overlay.
Thank you. As Bill mentioned, this is an annual review that we do of the cash overlay program. Now, although SDCERS does not have a target allocation to cash, cash is held at the portfolio level as a reserve to pay monthly benefits and also as to fund private equity and real estate capital calls. Cash is also held at the manager level in order to settle trades. A cash overlay program is a cash management tool designed to keep a portfolio more closely aligned to its performance targets and to its target asset allocation and its performance goals through the use of futures contracts. Yesterday, the committee heard a presentation from Parametric, who is our cash overlay manager. They were hired in December of 2008. The program continues to function as it's supposed to, and we've not had any problems as of yet. Through the end of November, SDCERS has earned an additional $166.4 million since inception, or approximately they've added about 53 basis points of return. And with that, I can answer any questions that you have about cash overlay.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Now we'll move on to real estate market overview. That was interesting. They had some nice charts in there, kind of showed where it looks like the market's beginning to peak.
I'm just gonna, there is a great chart that I wanted to show you guys. I'm a picture person, I see things better in graphical format. As you can see, this represents the U.S. real estate cycle and where Aon Hewitt believes that we now are. You can see the yellow where it says now here. We are approaching the top. I just wanted to give you a few takeaways of what Kate Polly's, the head of the real estate group, had given us. Now is the time that we need to protect the portfolio. We need to mitigate any downside risks, such as the action that you just took with the real estate separate account. That's a good example. In addition, we know that real estate returns are going to moderate. They've been above the long-term average for some time now. It cannot continue into the future. So we can expect our returns to start coming down. Property values have mostly recovered from the past peak levels. But what hasn't recovered are rents and income. We still expect to see some growth there, so we can expect that going forward. And where we are in the cycle mandates that we need to be very cautious in the managers that we're selecting. You need to know that your managers have experience with the cycle and choosing the right investments to make, and also have they weathered these sort of conditions before. You can expect that staff and the consultant will continue to bring you the best ideas and managers for your approval. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
No questions, so we'll move on to the staff report.
The reconciled market value of assets as of the end of November, as reported by State Street, was just over $6.8 billion. Since the prior board meeting, 7 wires totaling approximately $8.4 million were sent from the custodial bank to the operating account at Wells Fargo for the payment of lump sum payroll payments and operating expenses. And 1 wire totaling approximately $45 million was sent in November from the custodial bank to the operating account at Wells Fargo to pay monthly benefits for retirees and beneficiaries. Additionally, a rebalancing action was triggered in mid-November due to an overweight in U.S. equities. As a result, $113 million was moved from U.S. equities into cash, which was then overlaid using the cash overlay program to the long-term target asset allocation. That concludes the report, and I can answer any questions that you have.
Nobody in the queue?
Thank you, Jamie.
Okay, that wraps up investment training. Johnny?
Yes, thank you. We've got a few trustees asking for training. Before that, I do want to mention I'll email each of you about your new fiscal year education plan. The education policy changed such that I'll meet with you and you can look at your entire year and plan out your education according to your committee, your responsibilities, and any weaknesses you may have. But before that, we have some training requests. If you could bring up Val Hoy and Tom Sullivan's request to attend CalPERS General Assembly March 5th through 8th at Indian Wells. And we will need a first and second.
I'm there.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passes 10-0.
Carol Broad is asked to attend Pension Bridge in April in San Francisco, California.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passes 10-0.
Ed Katroser has asked to attend the IFEBP trustee training in Las Vegas on June 27th.
Johnny, I've heard from one other person that that's a pretty good seminar, and I was considering it. Does anybody else have any information on that provider?
I know IFEBP puts on a lot of training courses. I haven't attended them personally, but overall I hear they're positive.
Yeah, I've gone to them as well. They do get very good speakers at these conferences. The IFEBP includes Taft-Hartley plans, so you'll find a lot of information that's not relevant to public sector plans, and some of the presentations are geared with that in mind. So you sort of have to self-select when they have breakout sessions which one you want to go to. Some aren't relevant, some are.
But, well, I mean, if everybody thinks it's a fairly good program, I'd like to be added to that one.
So, I think it's the same one they also run just prior to their annual conference, which is very well attended as well. So,
The one on here is, I think, March 14th through the 16th, is that correct?
The one that
investment
Ed
one.
wants to attend is June 27th through the 29th in Las Vegas.
Ah.
But there is another one that Bill Hayner wants to attend in March in Las Vegas.
Okay, I think the one in March is the one I'd like to get to. I'm sorry.
So could you leave it as is?
Let's see, June. Where's the June date?
You're leaving. You're not. Okay, we'll need a first and a second for Ed Catroser to attend this event.
I have a mover of Bill. I seconded.
Ready to vote?
I got it here.
All votes are in.
And that motion passes 10-0.
And the last training request is for Bill Hayner and Thanasi Priyabalos to attend the IFEBP Investment Institute March 14th through the 16th in Las Vegas.
I have a mover of Karina Coleman, second to Val Hoy.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passes 10-0.
That's it for me. Thank you, Alan.
All right. Thank you, Johnny. That brings us down to questions, comments from the board, staff. Anybody? Another great discussion today. No non-docket items, and now we'll move into closed session.
Waiting on site.
Go.
Okay.
Ready?
Ready.
Okay. Coming out of closed session, there's nothing to report out, and therefore we are adjourned for the January 8th, 2016 Board of Administration.